Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be looking at the top 8 and meta breakdown of the Barcelona special event which happened last weekend. This was the first regional or special that was under the TPCI official streams over in Europe, so big strides there. I was actually part of the casting team this time around, so if you do want to go back and check out some of the games, you can do so on the official YouTube channel, which is going to be the place for all of the streams throughout the year, which is really exciting, to be honest. Seeing some parity between NA and EU is always great, and it also means more casting opportunities for myself, ideally, which could be fantastic as well. I'm going to try juggle playing and casting this season. It's going to be a tough invite for me for sure. But let's focus on our top 8 players. But first, I want to look at the usage of decks on day 1 and 2. Have a little look at the meta, because I feel like with 151, it's going to be another subtle shift from Obsidian Flames, where there could be some extra buffs for the likes of Miraidon players and for Lugia players. Ironically, we don't see Lugia on this deck usage of day 1. I feel like those are the bigger winners of 151 because they get a Mew EX inserted into their deck. I think Giratina might lose a bit of ground because it gets knocked out a lot easier by a Mew EX. But I think most other decks in the format are going to remain quite similar as to where they are now. Possibly Charizard gets a small buff because it gained a 70 hit point Charmander. So the graphic was really interesting to me for that day 1 usage, where we have Gardevoir stuck in the middle of a Lost Zone sandwich, where we have basically 28% of Lost Zone decks, most of them leaning on the Giratina V-Star side, but also a lot of turbo-based variants. Then we have Mew VMAX being the 4th most popular archetype, followed by Miraidon, which had just come off a great run in Pittsburgh, a few players actually having deep runs in the tournament with it, and having that juggle of will we or won't we play Path to the Peak? Because, of course, Jesse did so well with a beach court-based version, but in the Champions League, in Yokohama, where 151 was legal, it was another Path-based build, which sort of reinforces what we knew from the World Championships, that Path enabled this deck to have more well-rounded matchups. And then Charizard EX made it onto the graphic as well for day 1. Now, it says Charizard EX plus Arceus V-Star. I think it was lumping all Charizard together, and the secondary card just happened to be an Arceus. So I'm pretty sure the 58 decks that you're seeing there is bunched between Arc Pidgeot builds, Lost Zone Charizard EX builds, as well as Gallade-based Charizard builds like we saw in Yokohama. So I think that's bunching all the Charizards together. It did seem a lot more popular in the room, just me scouting tables in the opening stages, but it wasn't all Arc Pidgeot. I feel like Arc Pidgeot was already falling out of favor going into this tournament. It was actually other builds being played. So yeah, it seems like there was less than probably 8 or so % of Lugia, which is a real surprise. Another deck that did fairly well in Pittsburgh and was super popular, actually, at the World Championships, and was fairly popular in Pittsburgh, especially when we look at the day 2 usage, where Lugia really jumped up to be the 2nd most popular deck in day 2. So its conversion rate was insane, seeing 9 of them make it into day 2 when, less than 8% of the room probably were playing Lugia to begin with, which is insane. Lost Zone Box really outperformed Lost Zone Giratina. Gardevoir basically remained with a pretty solid standing. Charizard actually did pretty well as well. I mean, it started in 6th position on the day 1 of competition, and then there were 5 of them converting into day 2, which really isn't too shabby. And also seeing Inteleon VMAX creep into the graphic as well was a good omen for, well, certainly Francisco, who ended up winning the tournament, which we'll look at his deck list in a moment. So yeah, a really interesting spread from day 1 to day 2. It seems like another in-person tournament where Lost Zone Giratina comes in super popular, but doesn't have a fantastic conversion rate. I think I'm starting to get on the train of thought that Giratina has so many 50-50s, it actually doesn't have any good matchups. So you have to play really well, but also have really good RNG with Tina to actually get 6 wins. I feel like so often you're going to have 4-4 records with the deck, or even having Dreaded Ties in there as well, because you just have so many fine margins, and the deck is still fairly slow, so you don't exactly sit down against anyone and feel relieved. Every single round is a slog, and I think that is what equates to a pretty low conversion for Giratina. because ultimately you don't really capitalize on anything in the meta. You're just kind of shrugging against everything and hoping that you have better RNG in the matchup, or like in the best of 3 at least, that you have a couple games where you run pretty well and find your choruses and get into the game, etc. And I feel like Giratina's going to continue to lose ground in 151 because MuEX can blow them up. So it feels like Giratina is certainly not that S-tier deck. We've had 2 in-person tournaments in Obsidian Flames that are sort of proving that, and even the World Championships to an extent, even though it did make a top 4 placement overall for the amount of players piloting Losso and Giratina, it kind of didn't have that great of a performance. So seems like Tina was doing really well in online data for so long that it's created this narrative of being the best deck, and I feel like that's just not being reflected in the conversion rate of the archetype over a number of tournaments now. So just a small thing to note there. Let's get back to the top 8 decks then and talk a little bit about all of the lists. Congrats to Francisco on their Worlds invitation, as well as winning a special event. I think they actually have got second at an SPE in Europe previously. But yeah, having another fantastic tournament results. This seems to be a Rapid Strike build which has incorporated the Giacomo plus Spiritomb package, similar to what we saw Alex Szymanski play at the World Championships to a top 16 placement. And this deck just seems really solid. Like, yes, you're going to have those awkward rounds against Lugia. You're at least teching for Mew to try and make it a little bit closer, but it's still not something you necessarily want to come into. If you are able to make the Spiritomb Giacomo combo play out, then you are obviously stunting the draw power of the archetype, and if that's able to happen, maybe you can work in enough double gunners and Gmax spirals to two-shot some UV maxes. Maybe they're not able to string a knockout on your Inteleon because they're not able to cycle towards their power tablets. Maybe you're able to get a Cheryl play off, this, that, and the other. It's still a question mark, and it's still like quite an awkward matchup, I would think. Especially because they just still can play a couple of draw supporters and at least Judge and Roxanne, and they have Forest Hill Stone and a few ways around the fact that their Genesects are turned off. So I don't think it necessarily changes that you are still trying to dodge the Mew players, but it at least gives you a little bit of help here and there. But outside of that, as we saw, Lugia wasn't popular day one, so it seemed like a really, really clever metagame call. Probably a bit more dodge and weaving required in day 2 of the competition, of course, but there was still plenty of Gardevoir and Lost Zone variants around for you to cash in on, so the archetype still seems to be very powerful, and yeah, especially looking at the final, if you want to see a really good exhibition of how this deck can run smoothly, yeah, check out the final, because it was looking menacing in that game. Michael was able to get second place with Gardevoir. We don't have their deck list, but I'm pretty certain if it wasn't the same 60 as Tord's, it was 59 cards. I did manage to cast a round of Michael's, and I'm pretty sure I got to scout the entire deck list, and it looked very similar to the one Tord had, so I'm skipping down to his and covering both of them. It's Tord's World 60. It's, you know, very solid. It covers so many bases, has great consistency. Of all the archetypes this weekend, I was kind of most impressed with Gardevoir. It seemed like it was in control of so many situations and just had so much draw on key turns. And when you have, you know, 12 cards that you can see pre-supporter just so often, that's just going to mean that you're going to have the strongest turns possible and bounce back against everything in the format. So yeah, I'm still standing Gardevoir. We've seen so much Giratina and so much Lost Zone box, and even with those archetypes being the most popular decks in the room, I still can't get away from the fact that Guardi is feeling powerful. My one caveat is that going into the 151 format, there's even more headache around whether or not you should put down a Radiant Greninja, because now there are more decks that can punish your Greninja usage via a MuEX, like stealing your Moonlight Shuriken play. So maybe it's a new hurdle, a new challenge for Gardevoir going forward. But at the same time, Gardevoir can just play its own MuEX, and it makes it itself more versatile as well as the aggressor. So a little bit of gain and a little bit of potential headache for Guardi going forward, but I don't think it's really falling off anytime soon. Alberto was really the story of Barcelona, I feel like, having the top seed in day 1 with this Lost Zone Charizard deck, also safely making it into day 2, not having to worry about being on the bubble with their overall match points, and it seems like a really interesting variation of Charizard. We'd just seen in the Yokohama Champions League that a Gallade build had started to pop up, but it was actually this Lost Zone variant that seemed to do the best. And Alberto really has a lot of variety in the attacking options. We have the Crams, we have the Sableye, we even have 2 Gates plus Raihan to try and support a mini Moonlight Shuriken package. I feel like this is a little bit of call my bluff, similar to how we saw one water in Isaiah Bradner's Giratina at Pittsburgh, where if you just flash a gate or a water energy in the Lost Zone, suddenly your opponent has to play differently and respect the fact that you could just Shuriken them. So having that option, forcing your opponent to change their board state, is really interesting. I feel like these could end up being trimmed out for just additional switch cards or jet energies, which are a really strong card in the deck, even just an extra supporter here or there. But I do have to give credit for the fact that it makes people play differently around you, which is at least interesting as a discussion point. I really like the math that Lost Zone does with Charizard in combination. It's actually much cuter than I expected, where we have the early pressure of 110 from a Spit Innocently. It can lead really nicely into a Burning Darkness, even if your opponent hasn't taken any prize cards. But if they have taken one prize, yeah, it works even better. You can even be knocking out VMAX Pokemon. So Burning Darkness has a really nice follow-up play in the early game, but also it just has immense inevitability in the latter stages of the game, which is fantastic. And if there are situations where your opponent is trying to play around your damage output, you can mop up the damage with a Lost Mine and finish off something that was maybe 10 or 40 or 30 damage away from being KO'd by Charizard, whilst also setting up their next Pokemon or finishing off something else that's on their bench. So yeah, it seems like a really versatile combination. Lost Mine just seems to do so much to patch over the cracks of a Burning Darkness. At the same time, you're thinning your deck of energy really nicely with the Charizard as soon as you find that candy combination. It gives you retreat plays on your con phase as well, so it actually helps in your quest to just flower select throughout the game. So there's actually more internal synergy than I expected when initially seeing this list, but actually seeing it in action, it made a lot more sense to me, which was really interesting. I'm going to be putting a lot of time into this build. You know me, I'm a stan of the Lost Zone archetypes, and I was really impressed by Alberto's build. And I feel like there's more work to be done, possibly, especially when we gain 70 hit point Charmanders. The deck becomes even less vulnerable in Lost Zone mirror match situations. So there's a lot that I like here, and it's a really good baseline to work with. I feel like we will start seeing people cut the Water Gate package for just additional counts of possibly like Nest Ball, switch cards, that sort of thing. Even an extra supporter here or there. But I think the core idea is really, really powerful, and Charizard really impresses me. Its type coverage is still such a big boast just to outright win some matchups. But we know that the Lost Zone package is already just so dang strong that the combination works really, really nicely together. Let's have a look at Giancarlo's Lugia build. Nothing too much to write home about. It seems like a very straightforward 60. But Lugia just seemed like a good call for the tournament. When the Lost Zone variants are some of the most popular decks in the room, and even to an extent Gardevoir, these are matchups that you're not unhappy to face. Just because you have bulky Pokemon, you have one-hit KO potential, even your single prizes stay out of range of Crams and Sableyes, especially with the Radiant Serena, you make life really difficult for them. So Lugia just seems to be that deck where if it sets up, especially if it goes first, it's so dangerous into so many matchups, and it still has like enough consistency to get the job done. I feel like Europe at the very least was disrespecting Lugia. So we have looked at Tord's list already when we were talking about Michael, but also props to Tord for making top 8s. They bowed out of top 8 by prizing 2 Gardevoir EX, which is a little bit awkward. But yeah, the list is solid. We know by now that Tord's an incredible player, so not too surprising to see them in the top 8. We then have 3 Lost Zone boxes. They all fell in the top 8, but they were littering the top tables in day 2. Seemed to be really doing well and rising to the top for the most part. Miloslav's list was a very turbo-y based build. It played triple Pokestop. It played quad Super Rod. One notable thing that was missing from the deck list was it played no Drapion V whatsoever. It was just using Dragonite and Raikou. Outside of that, I feel like it was a very straightforward build off the top of my head. It was high on Vacuums and Forest Seal Stone. I think it played 3 of each probably. But we don't have the actual deck list, but that should give you a good idea of what it was like. We have Talon, who was playing a slightly less aggressive build where it has less Forest Seal Stone, less Pokestop, less Vacuum. It's also playing really interesting supporters. No Roxanne, but just having a couple Clara in here. And it also has a Hawlucha in the deck. We actually saw this a couple times on stream where a flying entry would change a lot of math, and it feels like people are back to teching this in for the mirror match situations and against Giratina, where you can sometimes have that surprise double knockout Lost Mine play where you fly into 2 70 hit point mons, then Lost Mine sweep them up. And yeah, it seems like with the amount of Lost Zone around in the game right now, it definitely makes sense. And even against Gardevoir, it can change your math here and there. So it seems to be a fairly worthy inclusion right now. To make Hawlucha work, you could consider adding back in something like 1 copy of Level Ball, just some minor food for thought there to try and enable it that little bit more. But we don't see that in this build at the very least. But it does have a ton of Pokemon recovery, I suppose. So that's a small thing there. And then we have Francisco Tovar's build of Turbo Lost Zone. Again, some slight variation here. We have the slightly thicker vacuum count again. Roxanne's back in the deck list, but we are seeing some other interesting secondary supporters with the Raihan and the Arven in here as well. Gives you some tool tutor, and we are seeing multiple stones coming into the deck list. I feel like Townstall serves the role of an Arven quite well in the deck, especially when this list is only playing 2 stadiums anyway. But I suppose Arven is somewhat of a 5th Colrus. It's basically, we have Colrus at home, where you can, at least turn 1 if you have Whiffed Colrus, you can still hit VIP Pass, you can still find Forest Hill Stone plus Vacuum, which can still end up ramping your Lost Zone to 2 more cards in there, whilst also tutoring out a card that you need. So it's a really backwards way of thinking about it, but every now and then Arven can be that sort of combo enabler, where it can, at the very least, help you get those Rod Gate combinations in hand when you need them. It can help you get Forest Hill Stone Vacuum as a mini package, and it can just help you get VIP past turn 1. So it's not like a super high value, but also not the worst supporter I've seen in the deck. It's at least proactive, and slightly worse than Chorus, but not to the point where it's like hideous to see it if you have whiffed the primary supporter. But outside of that, it's looking pretty solid. So yeah, that's going to wrap up the Barcelona special event. I had a blast casting it, and I got to cube on the Sunday, which was exceptional. My favorite thing to do in the world. I'm going to be trying to cast as many of these tournaments as they will allow me to. I'm going to try and play in as many events as I can register for as well. So I'm going to be very busy this season, getting fully integrated with all the regional and special events and trying to head to some ICs as well. I'm so pumped for the start of the season. We've already seen a good mix of the tried and trusted, as well as people experimenting with brand new archetypes and bringing it to the tables. Charizard is certainly that card that's just so well statted that it had to see play in some iteration, and Alberto gave us a really good idea of how it can be unlocked and broken. I'm going to be putting a lot of time into this Charizard build, especially when 151 comes out, because having 70 hit point Charmanders is another bonus for the archetype. So let me know your thoughts on the top 8 as well as the meta breakdown. What's the best deck to be playing right now? Have you put time into the new Terrastal Charizard Lost Box? I really need to find a new name for Charizard Lost Box, because now there's a Radiant and an EX build out there. Somehow Lost Box is getting even more versatile. But that's it for today. Hope you did enjoy, and I'll be back tomorrow with another video. Cheers.